It's a bit intimidating to start first, but I hope everything will go well. I will talk in English, but we can also have a discussion in German afterwards if there are some questions in German. So my contribution on this to this symposium on the plurality of voices that gravitate around the not only the Warburg library, but really the Mnemosyne project, will focus on the philosopher and art historian Edgar, who was not only one of Abbe Warburg's closest collaborators in the final years of his life, but also the author of one of the most ambitious attempts to systematize and give really philosophical stringency to Warburg's approach to the sciences of culture and to his thoughts about memory and symbols. This is true in particular of two texts that Wind wrote in the early 30s. The first one is his lecture on Warburgs Begriff der Kulturwissenschaft und seine Bedeutung für Ästhetik, delivered on the occasion of the 4th German Congress of Aesthetics in 1931 in Hamburg. This lecture was addressed to the conference members during a special session of the conference held at the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, and Wind explicitly emphasized that, I quote the sentence which is also on the show, this talk is actually intended as an invitation to look at the panels that are exhibited around here in the hall. The second text is Introduction to the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliographie zum Nachleben der Antike, published in 1934, which exists in two different versions, a German, a little longer, and an English one. So naturally, Wind's attempt to systematize Warburg's ideas was only possible through the application of new theoretical filters. I would like to deal in particular with one such filter, namely a philosophical tradition called Pragmatism, which was born in the United States toward the end of the 19th century and emphasized, among other things, the practical origin of cognitive and aesthetic processes, the importance of coupling philosophical reflection with empirical inquiries, and the indissoluble relation between the process of symbolic formation and the individual or collective experiences out of which they spring. Now, Wind himself got to know the philosophy of the Pragmatists during his American sojourn from 1924 to 1927. So this is immediately before he got to know Warburg in Hamburg. He personally met the most important living representative of Pragmatism at that time, who is the philosopher and social critic John Dewey, as well as a number of his collaborators who are not here. I just report the three most important names here. He also made acquaintance indirectly, because they were already dead, with the writings of the two founding fathers of Pragmatism, the psychologist William James and the logician Charles Sanders Peirce. The latter, in particular, exerted really a crucial influence on his thought. Wind is reported to have said that he considered Warburg and Peirce, so the two figures together, his only two, and I quote, masters. This circumstance finds quite an explicit echo in a passage of his lecture, of his Habilitation lecture, that he held in Hamburg on the points of contact between natural sciences and history, in which the two authors, Warburg and Peirce, are directly compared as representatives of a kind of historical psychology that looks for the implicit, hidden, or unintentional meaning of historical documents as a way to illuminate their scope and purport. So there is this sentence that Wind quotes by Peirce: "It is not the belief that men parade, but that which they betray, which has to be studied." End quote. Now, in this talk, I would like to suggest that this interest in pragmatism and this attempt to couple pragmatism with the Warburgian legacy provides us with a key to read Windt's writing on Warburg, symbols, and memory, not only an attempt, let's say, to make the thought of his German master more accessible and more internally coherent, but really as a highly original philosophical exploration of the scope and purport of Mnemosyne within the broader web of human culture. More in particular, I would like to interpret Windt as facing one major problem left open by Warburg's work. The problem of how exactly we should describe the dynamics of cultural transmission, that is, the ability of symbols to retain and pass on their content over time. Windt sought to provide a systematic answer to this question, perhaps even a more systematic answer than Warburg had done, and in doing so, he made use of argumentative strategies that are largely indebted to the pragmatist background that he was sort of bringing back from the United States. Now, while the role played by memory in this project is paramount, and we shall see that, we will have to keep in mind throughout my talk that memory is itself, of course, a polysemic concept. I will therefore organize my talk by distinguishing some different senses in which we can talk about it. We will start with individual memory, with Gedächtnis in German. We shall go on then to consider the dynamics of culture, or in Warburg's work, social memory, and probably in a more precise sense of cultural transmission. Then I would like to focus on the process of active recollection, or Erinnerung, which can in turn take one specific form for Windt, which is historical research. I shall then conclude with some remarks on the role that recollection, Erinnerung, plays in Windt's original assessment of the interplay between human agency and sociocultural structures. So let me start with individual memory. In his aforementioned lecture on Warburg's concept of Kulturwissenschaft, 1931, Windt broached this issue by laying particular emphasis on the link between, on the one hand, aesthetics, and on the other, a theory of expression which is based in physiology and psychology. As he concisely put it, to explain our ability to manufacture artworks and symbols, I quote, "We need not have recourse to speculation. We need only consider the way the human body functions." End quote. In this spirit, he presented a sort of sophisticated hypothesis about how the human ability to produce cultural symbols and also to behold pictures and to make artworks might have been born out of the most basic movements of an organism within its environment. According to this reconstruction, the first germ of a symbolic activity lies really in the elementary ability of a simple organism to create a gap, an interval between the stimulus that it receives from the environment and the reaction that ensues. So there is this sort of gap that the organism can create, and this is the moment in which our ability to symbolize, to make a symbolic reference to that stimulus is born. Now, precisely here, we encounter for the first time the crucial role of memory, intended as Gedächtnis, as individual ability to retain traces of the past. The organism can remember the stimulus even when it's no longer there, and is able to produce a sort of delayed response. But the fact that this response is delayed also means, as I just said, that it's charged with a symbolic value. By reacting to a stimulus that is no longer there, a bodily action is not simply reacting to it, but is actually symbolically referring to something absent, something ideal. Thus, the ability to remember creates that gap between the sensible and the ideal, which lays at the basis of every symbolic process. Now, here is a question that we have to answer, though, because otherwise it remains on the layer of a sort of abstract speculation. How can the body create this gap? How can the organism make an interval between the stimulus and the response? How can it remember the stimulus so as to be able to refer to it later on? In Windt's text, the main answer to this question is provided by a simple, very 19th century idea, the idea of habituation, or the fact that, I quote, "The frequent repetition of the same act leaves its traces. Die häufige Wiederholung desselben Aktes hinterlässt ihre Spuren." The traces where? The idea is the act leaves its traces on the muscles themselves. So it's the body that carries the memory of the stimuli. This reference to habituation is a characteristic feature both of the physiological and psychological literature on memory that had already been used by Aby Warburg, such as Ewald Hering and maybe even more Richard Semon, but also of pragmatist philosophy. For Peirce, for instance, the American master of Wind, if you want, the symbol is precisely definable as the kind of sign which is able to refer to its object in virtue of a general habit of interpretation. So a symbol is not necessarily conventional, a symbol is not necessarily artistic, a symbol for Peirce is necessarily based on a general rule of interpretation that is given to us by habit. It is thus, I think, possible to imagine that Wind was really trying to underscore the vicinity of his two masters, Peirce and Warburg, when he insisted on the relevance of habituation in the genesis of symbolic entities. However, Wind also linked this pragmatist, maybe quasi-pragmatist reflection on habits and symbol with another crucially important thought that cannot be found in the pragmatist literature, but instead is borrowed from the German aesthetic tradition and plays, as many of you know, a paramount role in Aby Warburg already. I mean the theory of the polarity of symbols, which Warburg took from Friedrich Theodor Vischer. Let me briefly recall the basic outline of the theory. Each artistic and cultural symbol, says Vischer, and then is echoed by Warburg and Wind, oscillates between two poles. The first pole is an immediate connection between sign and meaning, a connection where the difference between the symbol itself and its reference really disappears. Famous example, the wine in the Eucharist, for instance, is the blood of Christ, and not merely a substitute for it. When it's interpreted in this strongly literal sense, the symbol immediately calls for action, for a strong identification with its reference. The second pole of symbolic reference is a sort of rational detachment between sign and reference, which thus calls for contemplation and reflectiveness rather than action. While the first pole is more related to religion and magic, the second pole points to the logical use of symbols, which is proper of science and philosophy. Art, for its part, figurative art in particular, inhabits the intermediate space between these two extremes. In doing so, it retains a vital connection to all other domains of culture, from magic and folklore through religion to science and philosophy. I think the combination between these two aspects, between, on the one hand, Windt's emphasis on habituation and a sort of pragmatic theory of human action that eventuates and ends up in symbolic reference, on the one hand, and the polarity theory of symbol, on the other, helps us understand not only the phenomenon of individual memory that I just talked about, but also the transition between individual memory and what Warburg would have called social memory or cultural memory, or we can use also the concept of cultural transmission on the basis of an inquiry into the expressive potentialities and the pragmatic features of the human body. This transition from individual to social memory takes place in particular in connection to Warburg's concept of pathos formen that Wind explicitly takes up. Specific gestures that were born in the ancient times out of particularly intense experiences and were subsequently stamped, vorgeprägt, on the social memory of European peoples and polarized, that is, deployed to express opposite emotions. Here, however, in the way Wind describes this basic insight of Warburg's work, we stumbled on a major problem. How should the historical transmission of Pathosformen from one generation to another, from one historical period to another, be explained? How is it possible for a gesture, once acquired, to travel in space and time and retain its meaning, even when this meaning is no longer obvious or transparent to historical actors? The Bilderatlas, which Wind may even have had under his eyes while delivering his lecture on Warburg, or maybe some version of it or some portion of it, presents many cases in which we might legitimately raise this question, but probably nowhere so forcefully as in the panels devoted to the Nachleben of antiquity in the contemporary world. Now, the aforementioned idea of habit may indeed appear to go some way towards solving this problem. One of the books that most influenced Warburg's theory of Pathosformen, and which Wind talked about, was Charles Darwin's 1872 treatise on the expression of emotions in men and animals. This book insisted precisely on the role of habituation to account for the fact that the human expression of emotions may gradually become a survival of previously functional gestures that travels in time. However, I would like to point to the fact that Darwin's theory suffers from some serious difficulties, of which I believe in his text from the early 30s, Wind showed some awareness. Darwin delineates a model that is ironically more Lamarckian than Darwinian when he talks about habits. He assumes that the bodily expression can be first acquired by an individual or developed by an individual as a functional response, and then passed on to their offspring merely by virtue of its being incorporated into a habit. On this model, bodily expression of emotions are first born as functional actions, then turned into habits, and finally transmitted from one generation to another. In the course of this transmission, they lose their original finality and take on a symbolic character. Though Wind did not write that explicitly, but I believe he may have been looking for a corrective to these shortcomings in the work of a pragmatist thinker, not Peirce this time, but the psychologist William James, and in particular in his theory of emotion as a sort of bodily feedback. In his Principles of Psychology, James attacked Darwin and his inclination to think that emotions are already preformed in the mind before being expressed by bodily action and then transmitted from one individual to another. James claimed, on the contrary, that the emotion itself is not the effect or the expression, and the expression is not the effect of the emotion, but rather the cause. In James' words, the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, we feel angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful. So here there is a sort of turning upside down Darwin's idea that first we try to express some emotions that are already there in our mind, in our moods, and then that this expression of emotion, this bodily expression of the emotion, can travel from one generation to another. James says, no, this is to put the cart before the horses. It's the other way around. We actually feel the emotions that we feel because our body is behaving in a certain way. I think we find an echo of this Jamesian thesis that was extremely influential and in its radicality also extremely important in 19th century psychology, in Wundt's 1932 essay on the heroic portrait on 18th century England. Wundt recalled in particular Joshua Reynolds' claim that you can put yourself in a state of emotional enthusiasm by, I quote, feigning a relish till we find the relish come, and feel that what began in fiction terminates in reality. Wundt commented that this claim, I quote, finds its scientific translation in the doctrines of contemporary psychology, end quote. I read that as a possible implicit nod to William James's theory. In both cases, you have the idea that, in fact, what begins as a bodily expression or as a depiction terminates in reality, creates its own object, creates the same object that it was intended to express. A few years later, in 1937, in a short essay on the theme of allegorical portraiture, Wundt further showed how this idea might complement the concept of habituation and the Darwinian idea of survival, so as to make our model of historical transmission of pathos form and in general of symbols more nuanced. How should we explain, Wundt asks, the persistence of the ancient custom of depicting sovereigns as gods or as mythological figures well into early modern times? Social habits, he says, are certainly a decisive factor in explaining the tendency of both actors and beholders to preserve older symbolic patterns. So there is a level of habituation that needs to be taken into account. In this sense, we might say, I would say with Darwin, that, I quote, what was real and literal has now become fiction and metaphor, end quote. So while ancient sovereigns would be Wundt's thesis, were more literally compared to gods, the comparison has later become increasingly metaphorical and still used on virtue of ingrained social habits of interpretation. And yet, we also need to take into account the presence of, I quote the end of this passage, a theatrical effect that reverses the process. What began in fiction terminates in reality, so that the human beings who acted the gods were venerated really as godlike beings, end quote. So the idea here is you start depicting something that becomes true on the level of social action and not the other way around. This argument invites us to look at pathos form as fossils, not only as fossils coming from the past, but rather to take into account the active role of historical actors in continuously recreating and rehearsing, as it were, the meanings conveyed by the pathos form. In this sense, we might say that the phenomenon of social memory and cultural transmission are inseparable from an analysis of the active efforts of individuals to revive the picture and symbols coming from the past. The most general concept Wundt used to denote this sort of active effort of individuals to go back to the past and revive it and recreate it and rehearse it is the German word Erinnerung, recollection. So I'm here touching the third point. After individual memory and social memory, recollection, Erinnerung. Also, he uses a very Warburgian word, Auseinandersetzung, a sort of confrontation, a confrontation that, with the past that is involved in all act of recollection. This latter word in particular, Auseinandersetzung, conveys well the idea that recollection takes effort, it takes energy. It's a struggle to bring to a balance the different spiritual forces that are embodied in symbols, but also it is a struggle to deal rationally with our feeling that we need to come to terms with those symbols. Erinnerung is not a luxury of humanists for Wind. It's really a necessity that we feel once we are implicated in a culturally laden environment. It's an obligation. But why is that so? Why do we have this feeling that we need to come to terms with the symbols of the past in order to deal rationally with our culture? One of Wind's most significant answers, there are many of them are, I think, borrowed more from the historicist tradition, from hermeneutics, but one of the most original and also for us significant answers is articulated in the other text I mentioned, the Introduction to die Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliographie zum Nachleben der Antike, with regard to a specific case, the specific case of ancient culture and of its influence on the contemporary world. For an inhabitant of the 20th century, he argued, the antiquity is no longer an unconditioned normative model, is no longer an absolute paradigm, but neither is it a neutral object of detached inquiry, as though we were indifferent to the presence of symbols coming from the antiquity. There is a middle way between these two alternatives, between indifference and absolute normativity. Although we recognize the historical contingency of the values expressed by antiquity, we nonetheless feel, and I quote, that we are geschichtlich verhaftet, we are rooted in, or maybe even held captive by, its symbols. In other words, the Nachwirken of symbols, the continuous effect that these symbols have on us, can be conceptualized as a force that we feel despite perceiving that it's not absolute or unconditional, but depends instead on our own specific position in the historical process in which we are embedded. And recollection is a way, in fact for him the only way, to come to terms with this force. So, as an aside, this is really similar to what pragmatist philosophers had to say about valuation as a sort of general phenomenon that is always there once we have to produce a normative judgment in aesthetics, in morality, in epistemology, and so on. So we always feel that we are attached to something, even though we can come to recognize that this something is historically contingent. At the end of the same text, the Introduction to die Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliographie, Wind went on to trace the implications of this idea for a general outlook about the dynamics of historical progress and the relation between social structures and individual agency. Human history, he claimed, advances in a sort of discontinuous and abrupt manner. There are moments of historical crisis in which the always fragile balance among different cultural forces that had been previously attained suddenly collapses, and people find themselves paralyzed by, I quote, doubt, and by the need for reflection. And there are moments in which this crisis is solved and people go back to, I quote again, the venture of action. Now, there's no need to point out that this oscillation between doubt and action, Zweifel and Handlung, is yet another rendition of the polarity theory of symbol, between immediacy and detachment, between action and contemplation. This should come as no surprise. Being shot through with symbols, human history ends up reflecting the structure of symbolic processes. However, I believe that Wind's argument implicitly relates the idea of polarity with another idea, one that comes once again from pragmatist philosophy. A crucial assumption of that philosophy, in particular of the epistemological works of Charles Peirce and Dewey, is that our thinking goes back and forth from a phase of doubt, in which we find ourselves at a loss on what to do or think because some obstacle or problem has shown up in our practical situations, and on the other hand, a phase of belief, in which we overcome that problem by creating a new rule of action, a new habit. Now, pragmatist philosophy traditionally solves this problem of how to go back from doubt into belief, from reflection into action again, by having recourse to one major instrument, which is inquiry, and in particular, experimental inquiry. It's a strongly, it's a theory of cognition that is strongly based on the idea that the model of scientific inquiry can be generalized to intelligent coping with the environment as a whole. However, Wind, which was a profoundly experimentalist thinker, he actually wrote a book called Experimentum Metaphysique, in which he tried to insist on this experimentalist understanding of cognition. However, he added another very important tile to this puzzle, another very important concept, the concept of memory. His argument entails that the problems posed by the socio-cultural world cannot be solved by a sort of ahistorical form of inquiry, but can only be tackled by drawing on the resources made available by Erinnerung, by recollection. Moreover, the function of recollection is itself internally polarized. Erinnerung not only helps us solve our problematic situations by bringing us back from doubt into action, as was the case with a simpler pragmatist model, it can also have the opposite effect. It can lead us to stop and doubt again, or to reflect further. I quote from the English version of the introduction to the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliographie: "Memory which revives and reinterprets traditional symbols calls for reflection or instigates action and thus affects periodic reversions. In the critical moment before the deed, the remember symbol works as a model or as a warning, in the pauses of doubt as a spur or as a rein." End quote. So let me close on this point. Here again, in this very quote, we've seen an idea that I think has accompanied us from individual memory into social memory or cultural memory up to the problem of recollection. This idea is this: one of the most original traits of Wind's understanding of Warburg, and also of Wind's attempt to translate Warburg in a new philosophical language, is precisely his ability to reconcile some pragmatist insights with a Warburgian, but perhaps ultimately Nietzschean, insight about the polar nature of human experience and its eternal oscillation between a magical and a rational drive. This invites a final thought. The German philosopher Georg Simmel once said, or is reported to have said by a witness, and I quote, that pragmatism is what the Americans were able to get out of Friedrich Nietzsche, end quote. I think Edgar Wind points to a more interesting and also more cosmopolitan, less sectarian scenario. Reading the pragmatists through Nietzsche, or perhaps Nietzsche through the pragmatists, may give us a key to delineate a new philosophy of culture that does not content itself with being a critique of reason, as often is the case with modern epistemology, but is willing to take seriously everything that reason would like to discard, would like to suppress, or forget. Thank you.